Globalizing internet governance. The Europeans say it's time for the US to loosen its grip on the internet. It all comes against the backdrop of those NSA leaks. But how much is the US willing to give up? And how will global internet governance be regulated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, it gives 2.5 billion people access to the world with the click of a button. But who actually controls the internet? Well, currently, the US-based Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN as it's also known, it's the one who's responsible for much of the web's infrastructure. But the recent spying activities of the National Security Agency, or NSA, have concerned Europe. Vice President of the European Union Commission, Neelie Kroes, now says it's time the US loosens its grip on the internet. She said recent revelations of large-scale surveillance have called into question the stewardship of the US when it comes to internet governance. Given the US-centric model of internet governance currently in place, it is necessary to broker a smooth transition to a more global model. So what is ICANN and why are people so unhappy about how it works? Well, it's because it plays such an important role in running the internet by assigning the unique domain names that allow us to find websites. We're talking about things like .com, .org or .net. ICANN is based in California. It's contracted by the US Department of Commerce to do its work. And that's partly what makes people so suspicious. You see, critics say ICANN's role should be decentralized to different bodies around the world. And of course, ICANN is just one of the many bodies that govern the internet's infrastructure, most of which is in the US. Well, that makes the US a hub for much of the world's internet traffic, giving groups like the NSA easy access to intercept our communications. Well, the reason we're talking about all of this right now is because NSA leaks have accelerated the debate. Take Brazil, for example, a country now spearheading the campaign for decentralized internet controls. Well, the leaks showed the NSA had penetrated the country's telecommunications infrastructure and even its secure servers. They listened in to Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff's phone calls, as well as leaders from other countries. And they accessed sensitive commercial information about Brazilian oil, gas and mining companies, which some argue would benefit US companies. Well, Brazil, like many other US-friendly countries around the world, were outraged by the revelations. They say they pose no security threat to the US. Now, to talk more about internet governance, let's bring in our guest, shall we? From London, Nigel Hickson, Vice President from Europe for ICANN. From Moscow, Andrei Soldatov, co-founder and editor of Agentura.ru, and a specialist on Russian security issues, surveillance and internet regulation. And from New Delhi, Pavan Dugal, advocate of the Supreme Court of India and chairman of the Cyber Law Committee. Good to have you with us. Let's start perhaps with Mr. Soldatov. What do you think should be done to make the internet a truly more global place when it comes to running the internet?
Well, I think that some changes are inevitable as too many countries are unhappy with so-called leading role of the United States in controlling and governing the internet. But to be frank, I have some doubts about some connection between these particular things, NSA exposed programs and regulation of domains. I don't think that these two things are connected. And I slightly fear that this argument about that we need to do something with the leading role of the United States might be used by the governments and the countries with very specific ideas of how the internet should be controlled, including my country. And we know that Russia promoted the ideas of so-called national sovereignty on the internet and essentially about installing borders on the internet for quite a long time, for more than 2 years. And about 2 years ago, this attempt was failed. And now with Snowden's regulations, with new wave of debate about how the internet should be governed, these countries got new chance to promote these ideas that we need to install borders on the internet. And I think it's a very dangerous game because as a result we can get something very far from the internet we know today. It might be just a collection of national internets absolutely under control of respective governments.
All right, you've opened a whole bunch of issues there. Let's take one of them one by one, shall we? And let's bring in Nigel Hickson into the discussion. The first of all, the idea that we're hearing that the US has far too much influence in internet organizations like yours.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's delightful to talk to you. First of all, no one governs the internet. I mean, the internet is a truly global entity, and there are lots and lots of players that make up the overall sort of operation of the internet, from private actors to association to users, etc.
So why the European
controls...
Commission so worried then?
Well, I don't think the European Commission are worried. What they're saying is that clearly there is a global debate on internet governance at the moment, and we all recognise the global debate. We've got a big multinational, multi-stakeholder conference coming up in Brazil. We have the ITU with a major conference later in the year. So there's a global debate on internet governance, and there's a debate on the relationship between internet governance and the domain name system and the US government. I mean, that's a clear debate. There's a debate about how ICANN, the globalization of ICANN, should take place. But I think, you know, we have to look at the different components, and to say that the US controls the internet or the US governs the internet is very simplistic.
All right, let's bring in Mr. Dugal into the discussion. Would you agree that perhaps you're expecting too much when you take into consideration that the internet was invented in the United States of America? Much of the web infrastructure either runs through the US or is US owned, and then we talk about how it should be a lot more global.
Correctly, you have rightly put it. Internet is a global phenomenon, but it's also a historical fact that internet began in the US. So, consequent to that historical reality, some new historical facts and pragmatic issues have come up before us. It's still a fact that a majority of servers are today located in the United States of America, and a majority of internet traffic today still passes through servers that are located in the US. Now that suddenly starts giving the United States of America some extremely unfair advantage as contradistinguished with other nations. Because the data flows through their computer systems and servers, they automatically assume jurisdiction. And I think US is not alone. Had it been for any other country, which would have been in US footsteps, they would potentially be doing the same. And that's actually assuming extraterritorial jurisdiction in respect of data, both of sovereign and non-sovereign subjects of legal entities and governments located outside the United States of America. But the fact remains that while the infrastructure has majorly developed there, a lot of developments have been taking place in different parts of the world. And now the action, as far as the internet is concerned, has already shifted to India, to China, and to Asia. That's where the majority of the biggest e-commerce and m-commerce markets are going to be. And therefore, we have to quickly realize that we need to come up with appropriate multi-stakeholder approaches where different governments can have their issues addressed. They don't want that their own subjects and their own information be surveilled upon by the US, whether under the garb of one pretext or the other.
People in places like New Delhi and China thinking about? Are we thinking of perhaps other organizations, or are we thinking about changing the current composition of current organizations like ICANN?
Well, currently it's a very wide open debate. There are no crystal clear answers, yes, but clearly it's very evident that there's no international treaty yet on these issues pertaining to internet governance. For cybercrime, we have a limited treaty in the form of Convention on Cybercrime of Council of Europe. And I think the different countries of the world are very clear. They do not want to disrupt the internet. But at the same time, these Snowden revelations have demonstrated that there are a lot of activities happening that may not necessarily be to the liking of different sovereign nations. And that's why a new trend has started emerging. Different countries have already started thinking of coming up of different ideas for balkanization of the internet, or coming up with intra-country specific internets. Well, the idea is very clear. They don't want their subjects to be surveilled upon. They want a more secure intra-country internet. But the fact remains, isn't that itself a paradox? And the chances are, if these kinds of intra-country internets are going to come across, these could prejudicially impact the efficacy of internet as a global mechanism. So I think a lot of debate has to yet go through, but clearly the geographical shift has to be well recognized. US is no longer the center stage as far as internet and internet governance is concerned, and the quicker the different existing stakeholders bring in the various different parties and entities from different parts of the world and make it multilateral and multi-stakeholder, the better it will be.
I think Nigel Hickson's trying to get in. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, there was a lot I could agree with there. I think that was, very cogent, very intelligent indeed. I mean, we are in a really global and dynamic situation here. I mean, clearly the next billion, the next 2 billion internet users are not going to be Latin-based speakers. They're not going to be in England. They're not going to be in the USA. They're going to be in Asia and other parts of the world. And I think there's a real recognition there, and that's one of the reasons why ICANN is globalized. It's one of the reasons that we're introducing new international domain names. One of the first international domain names to go live was Shabaka last week. And I think there's a recognition that internet governance is becoming more of a global force. But at the same time, I think we have to differentiate if you like, the historic and technical capabilities that exist in the US. Of course, as is rightly said, a lot of servers, a lot of infrastructure exists in the US, and that's a historical and an absolute fact. But the actual governance, of course, is shifting. ICANN has already said that it's going to evolve its relationship with the US. We are a non-for-profit organization based in California, but we have offices in Singapore, we have hub offices in Istanbul, in Singapore, and engagement offices in many other parts of the world, and we're becoming more global.
Other than having, Nigel, other than having offices in different parts of the world, then, how would you answer the calls that say the US has too much influence in ICANN? What is your 5-year or 10-year plan on your desk saying that, how are you going to deal with that?
Well, I mean, if our chief executive, Fadi Chahadi, was sitting in front of you this afternoon or this morning or whatever, he would clearly say that the globalization program for ICANN that he is spearheading as the chief executive is something that started a year, 18 months ago. It certainly started before the revelations of surveillance and the NSA and Snowden. It's a globalization program in terms of people, in terms of ideas, in terms of bringing more people into the internet ecosystem, and evolving this historical link with the US. It's no one denies that there is a link with the US authorities, and we have said that we're evolving that. The European Commission called yesterday for a timetable for evolving that relationship in terms of the root of the internet and the IANA function, and the US responded in a statement last night to say that yes, this is something that is evolving. This relationship is evolving.
All right, let's bring Mr. Soldatov back into the discussion, actually on a point which you kind of touched upon earlier. Looking at some of the statements, for example, from the European Commission, if the concern that they have is that the NSA activities which were recently leaked show that, we've got to take another look at US stewardship of the internet. And then they go on to talk specifically about ICANN, and I'm wondering how empowering other countries in ICANN will actually help with that sort of problem when ICANN is primarily overseeing distribution of domain names.
Well, I'm also quite suspicious. I don't quite understand this connection. Maybe it has something to do with the way how the traffic is organized globally, and that so many organizations complain that the traffic is not. For example, the inside European traffic might be transferred through the United States, and it's not necessarily, so we need to somehow to change this system and so forth and so forth. And because it provides some so-called natural advantages for the American security services. But the problem is, I think it's a very fragile system. And if you try to change it, legally, trying to impose some special rules, something like the inside European traffic should be transferred only inside of Europe, something like that, I think we might just broke the system. It was designed to provide the cheapest and the quickest way of transferring the internet message. And if you try to change it, imposing some special laws, I'm not sure that it would be efficient in terms of maintaining the capacity of the internet. And also we need to remember that it's always, the question is about content. And traffic goes where you have your content. And the point of pressure that we got from the countries with, as I said, specific ideas of how the internet should be governed was for quite a lot of time, maybe for 2 years, is to try to force global platforms like Google, Facebook and Twitter to host these servers on the soils of our respective countries. We have this situation in Russia when Russian government tried to pressure these free companies to host these servers with Russian customers on Russian soil, but we should remember why we try to do this. It's mostly because we wanted to have this information, these services, transparent for the local security services. So I think the problem is that we have the alternative. We have to battle in some way the menacing surveillance programs of the NSA, GCHQ, and so forth. But at the same time, we should think about other security services. It's not the problem of surveillance conducted only by the United States. It's a problem of surveillance, and we should fight and we should deal with this problem because it's a global problem. It's not a problem of one security service.
That's a good point. And I'm wondering, Mr. Dugal, now, one of the thoughts is, does a more global management system, shall we say, of the internet necessarily mean it's a more democratic and open one? Or will it lead to other countries doing the same, if not worse, than what the NSA is accused of doing?
Well, first and foremost, you'll have to quickly realize that ICANN is not internet governance. ICANN is a technical body which is only looking after technical aspects pertaining to domain name systems. Internet governance is a much bigger game plan, and clearly ICANN's even mandate does not really encompass various aspects of internet governance. But the question arises is, here is one particular anomaly. The ICANN is a not-for-profit body which is incorporated in the state of California, subject to US laws and therefore subject to all kinds of directions by the US government. So by that standard, the different countries who are being put up on GAG or other committees of ICANN are effectively going to be subject to US jurisdiction. That's one particular issue that's not really gone down pretty well with large number of governments. And here is a question of one government versus many governments. Because there's only one government, being the United States, there's virtually no checks and balances. But I think if there is going to be a more multi-stakeholder international approach which realizes that internet is a global heritage for mankind as a whole, I think there is going to be balance, there is going to be equitableness, and more significantly, there will be these checks and balances which will prevent any potential abuses. Well, we are not living in an absolute world, and utopia is non-existent. So some kind of, shall I say, ups and downs will happen. But because there are going to be more stakeholders, more international governments who are going to be involved in this forthcoming emerging international management scenario vis-a-vis internet governance, I believe there are going to be far more checks and balances, and I think every government will have to be concerned about ensuring that it's not being seen in a bad light. It's indeed correct and paradoxical at the same time to realize
that's an interesting
that sovereign
point.
Interests.
And I do have a question on that, but perhaps this might be a good point to also remind us, since we're talking about the global future of the internet, might be a good time to remind us of the origin of the internet. While the US, of course, has always maintained control of the internet, it wasn't always under ICANN. Now, the internet was created in the 1960s for a small group of military, scientific and research personnel, so soldiers could communicate without revealing their locations. But by the mid-1990s, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and the internet becomes mainstream. Initially, it was controlled by the US government, but in 1998, the Clinton administration handed control over to ICANN. In 2009, the US and ICANN agreed on an affirmation of commitments which permitted the corporation more independence, but retained the ability to take over server control in, quote unquote, an emergency. All right, let's bring in, speaking of ICANN, let's bring Mr. Hickson back into the discussion here. You know, the sentiment that we were just hearing there from New Delhi was, well, if you have more stakeholders kind of empowered, it's better than having, I guess, one country having some kind of monopoly on what they're doing. But my question is, if we may have competition between different governments in running the internet, who speaks for the individual? Your organisation doesn't represent the individual, does it?
Well, you know, there's a whole host of issues here. I mean, first of all, I disagree with some of your summary in terms of control of the internet. I mean, as we were just discussing now, ICANN has a responsibility for the domain name system. The domain name system is but a small part of the internet architecture, and the architecture is a small part of the overall internet. No one controls the absolute internet. But it's true that ICANN was set up and there is a link with the US government. That link with the US government is because we're incorporated in the United States, and there is this link with IANA, with the root of the internet, as we discussed. But within the ICANN framework, we have a multitude of stakeholders. It's not just governments. We have over 130 governments in our Government Advisory Committee, but we have users organizations, we have registrars, we have registries such as the very successful country code registry in Moscow. Russia has a very successful country code registry. India has a successful country code registry. They are involved in the ICANN community. So ICANN is a community of interests, and all the different players come together. And to say it's dominated by the US government, well, I mean, you know, frankly, they would laugh, because, you know, I've been in the discussions when the governments argue about certain issues, and the US government don't always get their way.
Right.
Not at all. I mean, all governments have a contribution to make to the policy development. We've just been introducing this myriad of new international domain names and other types of domain names, and that particular debate was a community-driven effort. It's not dominated by the US government.
All right, Mr. Soldatov, let's talk about one scenario which is not very hypothetical. Some countries are actually working on making their own internets. Is the future a future of internets rather than an internet? And what would that mean?
Well, it means basically that these countries would force global platforms to host their service on their soil. It would mean that the system of internet filtering, which actually is already in place in many countries, and by the way, it's maybe a coincidence, but the most active countries which try to promote this idea of shift some powers from the United States to international bodies like ITU, there's the countries with very strong system of internet censorship, including Russia, unfortunately. And I think that would mean that the internet would be, but for customers, the internet would look absolutely different in different countries. And we just lose this idea of something global which actually unites us. Because in some way, I think it's, in a part it might be unavoidable, because not only governments, but even the companies, I mean global companies, are interested in presenting and providing us customers localized versions of their products. And if I, from Moscow, go to Google, I go to google.ru, and not because of the government pressure, but because Google wanted me to access local version of the page of the search engine. And the same goes with Facebook, with Twitter, with other platforms. So I think it's in a way it might be unavoidable. But well, I'm to be frank, I'm quite skeptical about what the international community might take. Remember that when Russian ideas of changing the rules on the internet were suggested at the ITU summit in Dubai, more than, as far as I remember, more than 80 countries supported these ideas. And not, well, by chance, or maybe not by chance, but many of these countries promote ideas of strong internet censorship.
All right, we're going to have to leave the discussion there. As fascinating as it has been looking into the crystal ball of the internet future. Let's thank our guests, though, now. Nigel Hickson, Andrei Soldatov, and Pavan Dugal. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us your feedback, just email us your thoughts at inside story at aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. It's goodbye for now.